happens when a real estate transaction doesn't close? You're selling a property, you're buying a property, and you're almost at the possession day, but we call it in the contract the completion date, and then somebody backs out or just can't close. Well, a lot of things, depending on what the situation is, will impact on what happens when a real estate transaction doesn't close. For instance, if the buyer just can't get a mortgage last minute, then they can't close. The seller is going to keep their deposit. The seller can sue them for any damages they have, and the buyers, because they can't close, is in trouble. Now, maybe a buyer, if they have no money, it doesn't make sense to sue them because there's no assets to get from them, even if you win, but sometimes they do. Presumably they had some down payment money and some money when they signed a contract to buy a property. Other times it's the seller. The seller can't close because there's not enough money to pay out their mortgage, they're not Canadian residents for tax purposes and there's a withholding amount, or sometimes they just change their mind. Other times it could be because there's a fire and the house just doesn't exist anymore. So we'll look at some of the different situations when a house sale doesn't close as to what would happen. Let's take the last one, where a situation where there's a total loss fire and that which the parties bargained for no longer exists. In those cases, the buyer has a right to hear what the insurance is, like what are the options here. And in most cases, the option will be, well, the insurance company is going to take the next year or so to rebuild the house. Other times, if there's no insurance, then obviously the answer is that the buyer is going to walk away and they're fine and they get their deposit back. If there's a full fire and the buyer decides, I'm not waiting for this new house to be built, then they walk away, they get their deposit back, and the seller has to go through the process of rebuilding. The advantage to the buyer, though, if they decide to wait, is they're going to get a brand new home that's rebuilt versus the old one. So there's lots of pros and cons. You want to discuss the specific legal situation with your lawyer at the time something happens to make sure you're making the right choice for yourself. Now, if the seller, one of the other situations, decides, I just don't want to sell anymore. Maybe property values have shot up, maybe they decide they don't want to move, or it's too hard to find a new house. Whatever the reason is, the buyer can, one, say, well, you've breached this contract, walk away, buy a new property and sue for the damages, or they can apply for something that's called specific performance. And in law, we recognize that each piece of real estate is unique, and that's one of the requirements for specific performance, and that's an application to the court where you're saying, court, look, like this property is unique. Even if I sue and get money, it's not the same, and it's not like acceptable in terms of getting money versus having this specific house. So with specific performance, the court will order the transfer of that title in exchange for the money agreed to for the buyers, and the buyer gets the benefit of it. Again, the contract in Alberta, we have this clause that's called a solicitor and client clause, meaning that the amount that you pay your lawyer, the reasonable legal fees, should be paid by the party that loses. That's not something you get normally. Normally you just get court costs, but when it's specifically drafted into the contract, it's much more likely you're going to get the bigger amount for the situation. Now, where someone just can't close, it's not a matter of choice, specific performance won't work because if a mortgage can't be paid out, there's too much debt, the court can't just make it disappear. So in that case, the property may end up going into foreclosure where the person just can't close, the seller, the buyer would get their deposit back and go and find a new home. Again, in these situations, if there's no money, no assets, it might not be worth suing, but it's one of those things you want to pay attention to. In any case, if you're a buyer or seller, you want to reach out to your lawyer as soon as you know there might be a change in circumstance. In some instances, we work with our client and there's a way for them contractually to get out of a transaction, which allows them to exit the deal, get deposits back, or just get out of the deal without any further legal consequences. In those cases, we just unwind it. We call it ab initio. We avoid it right from the beginning, and everyone goes their own separate way as if the contract never existed. Sometimes that works for the best. Sometimes that only works for the best for one party and not the other. But that's one of the things we'll go through with you as a buyer or a seller who wants to maybe change their mind about the transaction. Sometimes people will ask, well, what if I'm buying a house and I want the ability to just change my mind randomly? Well, first, don't just not waive your condition, because then you're offside the contract. You have a requirement to waive a condition in terms of your conditions to act reasonably and in good faith and make reasonable efforts to satisfy your condition. If you don't do that, it's a problem. So what does that mean? Legally, if you want like a I just want to change my mind, maybe clause in the contract, you can put that in. Now, a seller may not like that for a buyer to have it, but contractually, there's no problem at all with doing it from a legal standpoint. You can say the buyer has up to this date to completely change their mind, they just don't want to buy. Again, it would be very unusual, and most sellers won't agree to it, but it's something that's possible. We want to work together with yourself, your real estate professional, the real estate agent, your mortgage people. So we all work together as a team to make sure that your needs are satisfied. So don't hesitate to reach out or have your real estate agent reach out to the real estate lawyer in order to make sure things go as smooth as possible for you.